Well, I think it's time to start. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for getting up so early to be with us this morning, and welcome to this first session. So I'm Daniel Lemétayer. I'm research director at INRIA, and I have the pleasure of chairing this session with Rocco Bellanova as a moderator. You probably all know Rocco, who has been a pillar of CPDP since its very beginnings. So Rocco is now a postdoc researcher at the University of Amsterdam, and he works on data, governmentality, privacy, surveillance, I think, among many other topics. So as we just heard, the main theme of CPDP this year is data protection and democracy. And for this first panel, we decided to focus on manipulation, which is, of course, one of the main issues, one of the main risks, I would say, in this area. So the title of the panel may look a bit ambitious, but I think it has the merit of showing that we have different levels of questions, of issues here. First, we have to agree on terms. What do we mean exactly by manipulation? And how does it differ from, let's say, influence or nudging? We also have to understand what's new in this digital society. We've always had some form of influence. Manipulation also has always existed. But what's new today? Is it a matter of scale? Is it a matter of nature? And is it really effective? Is it as effective as we believe or as we fear? Then we have also, of course, the normative question. What should be considered as legitimate, as justified, and what should not? And on what grounds should we decide where to put the red line? And last but not least, there is also the issue of implementation. If there is a red line, how can we enforce it? By what kind of combination of technical, social, legal means? So of course, we're not going to answer all these questions in 1 hour, but I hope that we'll be able at least to cast some light on these issues and to stimulate the debate. So we are happy to have prominent experts around the table. I know they have a lot to say, so for the sake of time, I will not speak longer. And I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Bart Engelen. Bart is an assistant professor at Tilburg University, and his research focuses on the interaction between ethics, political philosophy, and economics. I think that Bart is going to set the stage for this panel by introducing some definitions of key terms that we are going to use during the panel. So Bart, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And sorry for starting the day off with a philosophical analysis of a concept. That's about the most boring thing you can do, I guess, but I'll try to keep it as light as possible for a philosopher. So when the big question here is influence or manipulation, philosophers would always say, first define your terms. What do you mean when you use the notion of manipulation, and in what way does it differ from influence more generally? So I'll provide a conceptual analysis here. Because I think the main worry here is that there are a lot of influences in the digital world that are arguably manipulative and therefore unethical. So there are two main questions here. One is the conceptual, definitional question. What exactly do we mean by definition, by manipulation, sorry. And then there's the normative issue, what makes this unethical, or what forms of manipulation are justified and which aren't. So as an example, we'll use, and I think not just me, but the speakers after me as well, will use examples from the political world, the way in which online campaigns, for example, political campaigns are run. Oftentimes you've got these micro-targeted political advertising, all kinds of agents who are able and willing to steer online people who are online in specific directions, trying to influence their vote by using, for example, personal data. So targeted at a specific individual, often using these kinds of messages that are really salient, that provide like a really salient picture that they know will get people going. So because of the kind of data that they have about individuals, they know how to pull these individual strings, right? They know what makes us tick, and they use this kind of information in order to influence our voting decisions. Now, if you look at the literature, it's massive, it's always complicated. That's what happens when you go into philosophical literature. There's a bunch of definitions out there. Largely, you could say there's always three aspects of manipulation that are considered to be characteristic. There's the how, the who, and the why. The how refers to the process. Manipulation uses specific kind of means and techniques. There's always a manipulator, that's the who. There's somebody who's doing the manipulating. And there's a why, there's an underlying intention. The manipulator wants us to do specific kind of things, to make specific kind of decisions. And I'll go through these three aspects quickly. So here's the first definition, which focuses on the how, on the process, on what exactly is going on when someone or a digital environment, someone who is designing a digital environment is influencing you in a manipulative way. So manipulation occurs when one influences another by bypassing their capacity for reason, either by exploiting non-rational elements of psychological makeup or by influencing choices in a way that's not obvious to the subject. So you can see here that manipulation is a specific form of influence. If a political campaign would just provide you with information and then would leave it up to you to digest that information rationally, would just give you arguments why to vote for one political candidate or the other, that would be persuasion. That would be an attempt to convince you. That would be engaging with your rational capacities. What manipulation is doing is bypassing those rational capacities and trying to influence your behavior by tapping into non-rational elements. And you've got these, I mean, behavioral scientists have been publishing about this the last couple of decades. You've got heuristics, biases, salience, loss aversion, all these kinds of non-rational elements, elements that shouldn't matter from a rational perspective, that we still know influence people's decisions. Like, for example, the color of a word or a specific kind of image that's really salient. From a rational perspective, that shouldn't really matter, but by using specific colors, by using specific kind of images, this is the way in which you can influence people in an arguably manipulative way. So that's the how, the process. Then there's a who and a why, which I think is crucial to understand manipulation. So here's another definition. Manipulation undermines a person's capacity for reasoning. This is familiar, that's the how. And decision-making to achieve the manipulator's ends by invisibly steering the deliberation, emotions, desires in a certain manner and exploiting cognitive or other vulnerabilities. So again, there's the same element of the how here, exploiting cognitive vulnerabilities, undermining a person's capacity for reasoning. But what's new here is that there's an explicit focus on the who. Somebody is designing the online world, somebody is running these political campaigns, somebody is doing this with a specific intention in mind. You are being manipulated in order to achieve the manipulator's ends. If somebody's buying a political campaign, they want you to vote Republican or Democrat or what have you. If you look at algorithms, obviously you can ask the questions, do algorithms have intentions? Maybe not, but there's somebody who is designing the algorithms with an underlying intention and using the algorithms in order to steer you in a specific direction. So here the idea is that if you have an unintentional influence that's non-rational, I wouldn't call it manipulative. I don't think there's manipulation without a manipulator. If you go back to the 80s and you had a kind of like a private website and you were using a specific kind of color scheme with some green over here and some red over there, but without knowing what you were doing or without knowing that this would have an impact on what people would click on, for example, just because you like the color green, that's why you put certain words in green. I don't think you're manipulating the people who browse to your website. You don't have a specific intention. It might influence their behavior, it probably does. Other people who are influenced by green will click in a specific way, but there's no specific intention there, there's no specific goal that you're trying to, there's no specific direction there, but you intentionally want to steer the people who visit your website. Now, in order to get it clear, I think the who and the why matter most. So there needs to be an intention, there needs to be a kind of disregard for your own judgments and evaluations, and you need to be deliberately exploited by tapping into your cognitive vulnerabilities with specific goals in mind. Now, if that's what manipulation is, then the further question is the ethical one. So is it unethical and why? Often you've got concerns about autonomy here. So the ideal is that people make their own decisions, that they are self-directed, that they are in control of their own judgments. And what manipulation does is indeed this kind of analogy of somebody's pulling the strings here. Somebody is influencing me in a way that is outside of my control. I am going to vote in a specific way if I am influenced by these kinds of online campaigns, for example, in a way that I have reduced control over these preferences, judgments, and actions. Right? So that's the worry. You influence people behind their backs in the dark, and especially for specific kind of decisions like democratic decisions in elections. That's not what we want. We want these kind of decisions to be autonomous or rational. So again, I would repeat the message here from the definition part and the ethical part. So I think, again, what matters most are the underlying intentions. It's extremely hard to avoid the influence of non-rational mechanisms, right? The color schemes, words need to be in a specific kind of color, that's inevitable. It's also really hard to avoid the non-rational psychological makeup. These heuristics and biases are going to be there whether we like it or not. And if that's the case, I would not prefer to say that any kind of non-rational influence is unethical. That would mean that basically, if I have a specific kind of body language, it influences you in a specific unconscious way, that would automatically mean I'm illegitimately manipulating you. I think that would stretch the term too far. If I'm deliberately using my body language in order to steer you in a specific way that's not obvious to you, so there's an intention behind me using my body language, then it's more problematic. So I'll wrap up here. It's a lot of questions that still need to be answered, obviously. But I think that given the inevitability of these non-rational mechanisms in decision-making processes, I would focus more on the intentions, on the who and the why, in order to get clear on the legitimacy of specific online influences. Specifically when it comes to democratic elections and political advertisements, obviously, well, I think political advertisements aren't bad. They're bad if they're are coming from a really, if you have these echo chambers effects, if they're coming from one side only, if you're being bombarded by messages that influence you in this way continuously, so that you no longer can form kind of like an informed judgment, that you can no longer form your own judgments, that's when we have a real problem. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bart. Thank you for setting the stage and providing some challenging definition, I will say. And I will already a lot of questions. But first, we would like to open the floor for questions from the floor. So, any urgent question? After each speaker, we will open for 5 minutes the floor. So, we will then have a collective discussion at the end, but please. No question? Okay, I will break the ice. In your model, you're focusing a lot about the manipulator and the manipulated to some extent. I would like you to ask two questions. First, the feedback effect on the manipulator. Like, given that this is not a one game or one-shot game, I assume, but probably interaction are going to continue. What happens to the manipulator if the manipulation succeeds or does not succeed? So what are the practice of adjustment, or just a question of means, or also the character of the manipulator changes? And second, in your, and I will be a little bit provocative here, there seems to be a situation where the individual that is going to be manipulated is at the same time unable, or she is unable to be calculating or thinking in adverse situation, but it's still thinkable by somebody. So what about the protector? Who is going to protect these poor people from being manipulated? And how do you fit in your definition the role of the protector?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, when it comes to kind of like the feedback effect on the manipulator, I think that's interesting. When we in real life try to manipulate people, we're trying to figure out what makes them tick. We're trying to figure out what strings to pull, right? I mean, sometimes I try to manipulate my girlfriend into doing specific kind of things. I try to push various buttons in a way that she still doesn't realize that I'm trying to push her buttons, but I'm trying to look for which buttons actually to push. That seems like I'm a horrible boyfriend, but just take this as a hypothetical example. Now, what happens with these, I guess, online use of algorithms, for example, we'll talk about empirical stuff, to what extent that this is actually working. But I guess that what these people ideally have in mind is exactly this. I try to run a specific kind of ad. If that doesn't, try to design this ad in a way that I have pretty good evidence that will work, that this is the kind of button that will work when I push it. If it doesn't work, they can just go on and run different kinds of ads all the time. So if the intention is really to influence you in the way that they want to do that, I think one of the worries is that with all the personal data that's out there, they can continuously try and devise the specific kind of mechanisms, the specific kind of influences in a specific way. Your second question had to do with...
who is going to protect the manipulated?
Yeah. So I think there's obviously a responsibility for governmental agencies, especially in the democratic sphere, right? I mean, we want democratic elections to provide a specific kind of process in which people can express their values, their judgments, in a way that is unbiased, that is not deliberately steered in a specific kind of direction. I think we also have good reasons for this judgment to be more or less rational or more or less autonomous. So I think the governmental agencies have a really important role to play here. That's why when we design a ballot, for example, a voting ballot, or when you have to vote on a computer, we don't allow a specific party to, for example, buy the right to have their name printed in green or in red, or on top of the list or on the bottom of the list, right? So there's obvious things that the government should do in order to make sure that that the different political parties, for example, are being presented in an impartial way, even though the parties obviously have an interest in doing it in a partial way. That said, I think citizens themselves need to, become watchful, need to become aware of what's going on, and need to also try to protect themselves to some extent by getting informed on the different ways in which they are being manipulated.
Just a quick question to conclude this first part. I was wondering, you said that there was no issue, no ethical issue, if the manipulation was in line with people's own goals. But how do you define these goals? How can you, be sure that it's in line with their own goals?
That's a good question. So I think in general, like imagine being confronted by a specific kind of campaign, like Barack Obama's Hope campaign. If you are a Democrat, you don't feel that worried or that troubled by these kinds of campaigns, then you would feel worried about a campaign run by Donald Trump using the very same kind of techniques. I think in general that shows that these kind of campaigns, which also influence you in a non-rational way, you can still see that they align well with your more general values and goals. These are general. I think I don't need a political campaign to tell me what to think about really important things about I know the role of government in the market. What to think about abortion, for example. If some people have specific, well-formed opinions and that are in line with their overall values on things, and if you're confronted with a campaign that is in line with this, you're going to be less worried by these kind of campaigns than when a specific campaign runs against your goals and goes against those. Those are general terms. I wouldn't assume to know what people really think if they weren't influenced or something like that. That's a bit too far, but I would refer to kind of like the general goals and values of specific individuals.
Okay, thanks, Bart. Thanks a lot. I think it's time to move on, and our second speaker is Claude Castelluccia. Claude is a research director at TINRIA, and he has, I think, more than 20 years of experience in cybersecurity and privacy. His research interests today are mostly anonymization, privacy, cybersecurity, manipulation as well. And so Claude will bring us the insights of the computer scientist on these topics. Claude?
Okay, thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. So yeah, I wanted to give like a computer scientist perspective of manipulation, and I believe that computer science can actually help to address some of the issues, but can also be helpful to formalize a bit more what we mean by manipulation. And in particular, the field of machine learning can be used because there is like some kind of striking similarities between human cognitive system and machine learning. So first of all, in order to understand how we can manipulate people using data, it's important to try to model how people learn and how they take decisions, right? So one simple model would be to assume that we have like a brain. Of course, we all have a brain. And there is some kind of algorithm in the brain that learns from different type of data that we get through education, through information, through various experiences every day, various sensors, right? So you have this algorithm that generate cognitive models, right? A bit like in machine learning. And then you have this cognitive model that is used to make decisions and to take actions, right? So you have these 4 different phases. You have the learning phase, the decision phase, and you have these 4 different things. So then if you agree with this simple model, quite simplistic model, so how can we manipulate someone using this model? Well, there are basically 4 different vectors of attacks, similarly to what exists in machine learning. You can either try to pollute what we call the training data, so the data that is at the entrance, and this is what information disorder is doing. You can either try to attack physically the algorithm in the brain, okay, and this is a bit out of the scope of this panel because we're only considering online manipulation, but you could like inject drugs into the body in order to modify the way the brain is working. You can exploit the cognitive model, and here it's very interesting because the idea of the third attack is not really to modify the cognitive model, but to try to exploit some of its weaknesses, right? Typically by using cognitive biases. And the 4th type of attacks consists of attacking the execution of the action. So you're not trying to modify the decision, but rather you're trying to make the execution of the action difficult to happen. So some examples. So the first one, information disorder. We're talking a lot about all this fake news. And the idea is that if you add some information disorder, you will have an impact on the generated cognitive model, right? So that includes information disorder, but censorship as well, right? As soon as you somehow have an impact on the data that is being used to generate the model, you will actually manipulate the generated model. right? So the second attack, I will skip it because, as I said, it's out of the scope. The third one is maybe the most interesting type of attacks. It's very similar to what is called adversarial example in machine learning, right? So, and the idea in machine learning is to try to come up with some examples that will make the algorithm or the model fail, right? So you will misclassify some kind of input by just finding out the input that will trigger this mistake, right? So once again, you're not modifying the cognitive system, but you're trying to identify weaknesses. And there are different ways of actually manipulating the way we actually perceive stuff and we make decisions. So I will just give you an example just to show you, very simple toy example to illustrate what I want to say. So I guess you all see those blue lines, right? They're all parallel, right? Who doesn't see those parallels, right? So, right, the blue lines are parallel. So what about now? Are they still parallel? Does anyone see those lines parallel? Yeah, so maybe you should go to see an eye doctor. But they are parallel. They are still parallel, right? And if I put each of them one next to the other, you really see, you feel like they're not parallel, but they are, right? And there is only a small modification that I perform on this image. Can anyone see the difference? What happened to the black and white? Exactly. So the only small difference is that this black and white square were a bit flipped. So this is just a simple illustration to show you that a simple modification, some noise, can basically make your cognitive system, or in this case, its perception system, fail, right? And this is just, once again, a toy example. There are many, many other examples that exist. Other examples that, for example, that's a pretty old studies, but researchers, like psychologists, they show that by using image morphing, you can influence the vote of a voters, right? So that's a studies where they show that at that time it was Bush election. So you have in the middle the image of George Bush. The first image is the image of the voter. And the last image is the morphing, so it's a mixture of both images, right? So it's 60% is Bush, 40% is the voter. And at the end, you have something that resembles Bush, but still has the traits of the voters, right? And these studies basically shows that by this type of manipulation, the voter will actually, you will increase the probability that the voter will vote for these candidates, right? And this type of manipulation are quite easy to perform, especially now on Facebook, because you won't even see what the others are receiving on their system, right? You will be the only one receiving this image that is actually tailored to your own images. So that's the third attack. The fourth attack is what I call the execution attacks, and what basically the idea is to prevent someone from executing what he wants to do, his actions. So you don't want to modify his decision, you just want to make the action more difficult, and this is what we sometimes call, or this is what I sometimes call dark patterns, right? So you have different ways of, and the idea is to find tricks on the way you implement the interface in order to trick the user to do something that he didn't want to do. So there is a paper actually that describes the different type of tricks that exist. It goes from nagging, obstruction, sneaking, interference, or forced actions. Just to give an example, there is this notification, Instagram notification, right? Where they ask you to turn on notification. And it's interesting because you have two options. Either you agree or you say not now. There is not the option no, right? And if you click not now, you will receive this pop-up regularly. And at some point of time, you will be fed up and you will actually click on OK, right? So they will force you to actually perform an action that you didn't really want. And there are different many ways of actually doing that. Right, that was my last slide.
Thank you very much, Claude. And again, the floor is open for questions.
Good morning. I'm Gian Claudio Malgeri from University of Brussels. I found this presentation extremely impressive. And I come from data protection law and consumer law. So I wanted to ask you, we have Unfair Commercial Practice Directive who deals with manipulation in the commercial field, so not electoral, more consumer field. And I divide unfair practices between misleading practices and aggressive practices. I see a similarity between this distinction and what you were saying about cognitive manipulation and dark attacks, because aggressive goes in the cognitive phase, while misleading goes in the decision phase. Do you also see this, and do you think that this distinction is enough? Because the legislation is of 2005, I think that now is very outdated considering the great potentialities of big data manipulation, etc. So I just wanted to hear your inputs on that. Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not a lawyer, but yes, there is clearly a difference between, and this is the goal of my presentation, between actually tricking the user into doing something that he didn't want to do, so basically deception, right? And this is the last part. And the first part is more about trying to make the user change his opinion about something, either by using rational explanation, so this is more like persuasion, or by using some tricks like all this use of cognitive biases or fake news. Yeah. But yeah, maybe this, I guess you're right, we should revisit this type of law, taking into consideration these different types of manipulation. And I actually started this work a few months ago because I realized that everybody was talking about fake news and then we're actually talking about something else. So I think it's important to define clearly, formalize clearly what we mean by data manipulation. And once again, I think that computer scientists can help because we are used when we work on security into defining formally what we mean by adversary type of the attack surface. So we have like an old theory that could be applied directly, I think, to protecting humans against this type of manipulation.
Is there any other question? Otherwise, I have a question. I'm a little bit appealed by this shift that we already have in this conversation about moving from citizen or individuals acting in a complex, messy world and users. And because the notion of user presupposes a kind of a linear process with a program that is well-oiled or well-defined as the ones that you were showing us, and that has to resist attacks or different kind of attacks. But what when we bring it back not from a user, but from a citizen or individual perspective, living in a messy world, and where fake news are not really only for voting in a different way, but maybe have an effect on their behavior with their neighbors or other. So when with the end purpose, or what you call the last fourth phase concerning execution, is not very well determined from before. So what happens to your model in that case?
Well, I'm not sure I understand fully what you're trying to say, but I don't make the difference between citizen and users, right? And I'm actually a bit annoyed when people talk. When they only focus, for example, on political election, when they talk about manipulation, right? Manipulation happens all the time, even for commercial products. And maybe I think it's more dangerous than the political field because you have much less control and much less transparency. But is it the question you have?
I think I wanted to point out that your schema, it's very elegant, but it seems to be premised on a very linear program where there is an A and there is a Z, there is a clear line of action from the moment in which we intake information to the moment in which we make a decision. But especially what you were saying, I can see how it can work in the market situation. I want to buy a new pair of shoes, and I have a very clear purpose, and somebody is attacking my purpose by having me buying a different kind of pair of shoes, or maybe a sweater instead of shoes, or cigarette instead of shoes. But what happens when I do not have a clear purpose? I just navigate or browse through my life, and I have encounters all the time with neighbors, other people, the newspaper, and so on. So when the program is not very clear to me.
So yeah, I didn't have time to go through the details, but I have actually a draft that goes through all these different scenarios. And like in system security, you basically define 3 security parameters. The first one is confidentiality, right? You're trying to learn some kind of secret data that is part of the system. So that's the profiling part. And then you have integrity, which is you're trying to make the person do something that you define yourself. You have a goal, and you're trying to manipulate in such a way that it will do the thing. And the third parameter is more what you're saying, which is availability. You don't know exactly what you want to achieve, but basically you want to confuse the user. You don't have a clear objective, right? And this is typically what many of the propaganda campaigns are trying to do, right? And there is not a very specific objective. The only objective is actually to confuse. So this is actually taken into the model. I just didn't have time to go through the detail in 7 minutes.
Just a quick last question, but maybe the answer would be too long. The question is about means to detect or to counter these kind of manipulations. Of course, you didn't have time to talk about it, but quickly, are there, among all these different types of manipulations, do you think it is or it could be possible in the future to detect or to combat some of them, or are some of them clearly too difficult to deal by technical means?
I mean, that's really open research questions, right? And this is actually planned, this is part of my research objective, is try to define some kind of algorithm that could be used to detect this type of manipulation and maybe protects against this manipulation. But once again, I think there is a lot of work that is being done in the community of machine learning security that could be used to protect humans against this type of data manipulation, right? One simple example is you will retrain the algorithm with some of these, what is called adversarial examples. So we could do the same thing with humans, trying to show them this type of manipulation. At least they're aware and they learn that those type of manipulation exist. Another solution that is used in machine learning is basically machine learning. It's a classification problem. So you try to classify, and if the thing that you're trying to classify is at the border, you can basically make the thing flip from one side to the other, right? So what they are doing is trying to increase the size of the border. And if you happen to be on that border, the answer will just be, we don't know. I mean, it might be that you're being like manipulated. So we could think about the similar things, like maybe using critical thinking. So I think there's still an open research questions, but I'm convinced that machine learning can be very helpful to solve this type of, to address some of these issues.
Thanks a lot, Claude. Our next speaker is Judith Möller. Judith is an assistant professor at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research. She works on the effects of emerging technologies, in particular the implications of news personalization and political micro-targeting. So I think Judith will take the empirical point of view in this panel. Judith, the floor is yours.
I need the black box as well. Thank you. Yeah, good morning. I will add a little bit lighter empirical evidence that is not as dystopian as what we all just heard, but bear with me, it will get darker towards the end. So why are we talking about political microtargeting this much? That has all to do with Cambridge Analytica, and in many accounts, it was Cambridge Analytica that got us to Brexit, it was Cambridge Analytica that got us Trump elected. And many academics try to substantiate it because it would have actually been really good for us as communication scientists if this was true, because that would make our discipline really, really powerful. But we didn't really accomplish that. We couldn't find this evidence that it was really Cambridge Analytica that turned those elections around. Why is that? So, to activate you a little bit, who of you has seen a political ad in the last 2 years or so? online. Right. And who of you thought this political ad is so convincing, I'm completely going to change my mind and vote the other way? No one, not surprised here. And who of you thinks that there was anyone out there that saw that ad and was so convinced that they changed their mind? Couple, yeah. So you're right. It's not very likely that one political ad will change your mind. So ever since we started communication science, we knew that we would have to challenge this idea of this hypothermic needle of messages that just reach voters and change everyone's mind. And it's not even, not even the group of people that are really convinced by political campaigns is really small. And to show you what I mean by that, this is an example from a study that was just published last month. And they looked at German parties in a German election campaign, and they tried in a very nice, good way to find out how effective online marketing is. So it was in Berlin, and there were a couple of districts that got no online targeted messaging. There were a couple of districts that got the orange version, which was sort of the boring version. It was supposed to be less effective. And then there were a couple of districts that got the emotional, the more manipulative. There's a child, there are big eyes. So they expected this was going to be the most effective way of convincing voters. And what they found was that about less than 1% of voters changed their mind, and that the emotional campaign actually was less effective than a not emotional campaign. So it wasn't really working, but does this mean that we shouldn't be concerned? I think we should still be concerned, and that is because technology is moving so quickly. And now I'm going to tell you another story. This is from a documentary or something that the Belgian public broadcaster produced also just a month ago. And they wanted to find out how effective more targeted advertising is. So the example that I just showed you, everyone in this district got the same message. But now it's about finding the right message for the right person. So this these journalists, they launched a campaign in a small village called, I have to look this up, Eeklo, Belgians, help me, Eeklo. So, and they didn't not only target people in Eeklo, they targeted a specific group of people, and these are women that were environmentally conscious of a certain age bracket. And they told them to buy Pastinaak for all kinds of reasons. And what they found was that actually in this specific village of Eeklo, 300% more of Pastinaak were sold because of this campaign. Obviously, there are lots of reasons why this study wouldn't be published in an academic journals. There's lots of criticism you could add. But still, it's an impressive finding. And there's also one more academic study, and I have to stress that it's just one study, because academics usually don't publish studies that don't find significant results. So I assume that many people have tried to find these kinds of results and nobody did, but these people did. And what they did is they tried to target voters, not voters, consumers with ads that match their personality. So if you're an introvert person, you might be more drawn to the ad on the top right, whereas when you're an extrovert person, you might be more drawn towards ads on the bottom. And so forth. So they deducted what kinds of personality you have based on a test, and then they matched your personality with a certain kind of ad. And they did find significant effects. However, they were also a lot more moderate than what those journalists found in Eeklo, which is they found that people were 1.5 times more likely to actually buy the product. So why is this targeted advertising more effective? And that has to do with the fact that every one of us is vulnerable in a way. So this was my first CPDP. And I usually go to communication science conferences. And you might want to convince me that this is actually the best conference in the world and I should only come to CPDP in the future. And if you tell me this message just like that, it's very low chance I'll be convinced. But if you tell me this message in the morning, after I just woke up, and you use the right words, and you use a lot of statistics because I'm very vulnerable to all kinds of numbers, I might just be convinced. So what I'm saying here is that if you adjust messages not only to the person you're talking to, but also to the situation in which this person receives the message, there's a chance that in the future, these kinds of messages will be much more effective. So we are getting closer to this hypothermic needle after all, because of all these possibilities to match when exactly what person receives what kind of message. So what could we do about this? And just one small last piece of empirical evidence. There are many things that we could think of, and I think the next speaker will talk about this more in depth. So we could talk about not doing micro-targeting at all. There are technological solutions. We could be more transparent, though I have to say this. There was ProPublica trying to monitor what's going on Facebook in terms of targeting, and Facebook just closed the door on this. So yay for transparency. And about literacy. So after all these revelations around Cambridge Analytica, after all the big discussions that we had, how many people in the States do you think know that on Facebook information is targeted? Who thinks less than half? Yes, you're right, it's even less than that. So about 30% know how targeting on Facebook works, and all the rest of them thinks that there are other ways in which information on Facebook reaches them. And this means that despite these really big revelations, there hasn't been a sufficient enough increase in literacy. So it can't be the only answer, or we need to be much better in explaining what's going on.
Thank you very much, Judith. I open the floor for some questions.
Hello, I'm Gloria González Fuster from LSTS here in Brussels. I hope you're convinced slowly that CPDP is a great conference, CPDC is a great conference, CPDP is a great conference. So my question, I really like the presentation because it makes this link between online manipulation and science. So indeed we can have scientific research on online manipulation, but actually this Cambridge Analytica thing was based on science about how people are, so the psychometrics, a lot of articles published in international peer-reviewed journals. So we have science on online manipulation that leads to online manipulation that then we try to explore. And you said there was one case that was researched in a very nice way. You say this CDU thing. So what is for you very nice research on online manipulation? What are the conditions for this very nice online manipulation? Thank you.
I'm not sure I want to use nice and online manipulation in the same sentence. But so if you want to do an academic study about how this works, you face a lot of challenges. One is, so if you want to do it in the best way to actually show causality, you actually need to get people to a lab and show them to one group one kind of ad and the other group another kind of ad, and then you see the effect. The problem with that is that if people come to a lab and they're greeted by professors and they're in this university building, they are really intimidated by the whole environment. So we usually tend to find larger effects that are somehow impacted by this very specific environment, which is we call problems of external validity. So to overcome that, you actually want to have people in their natural habitat watching ads at home. But then you have problems that you don't have control over what's going on, which causes problem of external validity. So in the end, CPDP is the answer. I think you need to go multiple ways, use multiple disciplines, use multiple ways of trying to find out what's going on, how people are manipulated. And that even outside of those lab conditions, also just observe people as they engage with information and see what's going on. And I think it's very important to keep talking to computer scientists, because they know what's going on, like what is being tried out. This thing about morphing your face with the face of a candidate, I can see from a communication science perspective why this would be effective, because we like our face so much. But then, yeah, I wouldn't even know that this technique exists, so we need to keep talking to each other.
Thank you, please.
Hello, I'm Natalia Belova. I'm a computer scientist from INRIA. So to continue this discussion that we need to observe, what people are seeing and how they are manipulated, we as computer scientists usually have this problem that we cannot reach a large audience. So we can create browser extensions, we can create all kinds of tools, but I think this is a recurring question for us, like how do we reach a large audience? And if we reach large enough audience, like ProPublica did, we will be blocked. So maybe, I don't know, like, what is your opinion on this? Yeah, and I have So this is a question, and then I have also a comment. I think negative results in research have to be published as well. In the past, we've done a study on trying to detect whether there is a price discrimination in airline tickets, and we didn't find any positive results for this, but we still published our paper. So I think we have to continue doing this, showing that we did the effort, this is how we did it, we didn't find it in this way, so maybe other people can find something else using other techniques.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's so important to also see the other side, because otherwise you have this biased information of what's going on in the world reacting also to you. There haven't actually been this many studies about manipulation actually working. I think that has to do with technical difficulties, but I know of several studies that have taken place that found no effects and have never been published because journals won't take them. And that's sad because we need this information. But regarding on how to reach a larger audience, I don't know if I'm the right person to ask, but I do know from working very closely with legal scholars that they're actually very good in reaching a larger audience. So I would recommend working more with them and making use of their skills to talk to also policymakers and a wider audience and write good books.
I can just add something. There are a couple of papers actually that studies this type of online manipulation. And most of them are authored by Facebook, but that's the problem, right? They have the data. They don't need to ask consent to the users, right? And this is what you were saying. One of the problems, if the user are aware that they are being manipulated, they will change their behavior. And so there are a couple of papers. One on emotion propagation on Facebook that was published a few years ago. And I guess they are the only one that can do this type of experiment on the large scale. But then you have, of course, the ethical issue. Is it ethical?
May I suggest to take both questions at once? Because we want to go also for the 4 speakers and then open again. Please.
Okay, thank you. So Julian Rossi from the University of Rennes too. So I have a quick question. You showed us different studies that were discussing whether micro-targeting is efficient or not. And I think that's a very good approach and very interesting, and it's necessary to test whether it works or not and put it into question. And you showed that there is actually debate on whether it works or not, and it might not work that well. But the examples you showed were on one specific campaign. So you have one ad and you look at whether it works or not. My question is, do we have any studies on long-term effects of micro-targeting? So 10 advertisements going in the same direction over 3 years, do they change behaviors? And if not, can we do studies like that? And how could we imagine studies like that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question.
Yeah, Tobias Moschus from Datenschutzraum Germany. I would like to go in the same direction, and my question is, how do you analyze long-term effects if most of the effects are very, very little visible and you don't know how the previous intention or opinion was and how it developed over time?
Yes, good questions. I'm not aware, so there might be, but I'm not aware of any studies long-term of micro-targeting, also because this is a very new technology and because I don't think we could do this without Facebook. This is a real problem that there is no independent inquiry, because I think you are absolutely right that communication effects accumulate over time and they get larger over time. So you're not convinced by one message, but 100 might do the trick. So then the difficulty is to how to observe this. And I think that it's really important that we build some kind of tool moving forward, and probably all of us in the room need to do this together to allow independent inquiry into not only Facebook, but how people receive information online and how and to what extent they are targeted with specific information just for them. Because as far as I know, but Claude might be better in answering these questions, we don't have any kind of tool that could do that.
Thank you, Judith. So I think it's time to move on to our last speaker, Fanny Idvegi. Fanny is Access Now European Policy Manager. She's also a member of the European Commission a high-level expert group on AI, and I think that Fanny will tell about Access Now position on these topics and maybe what the European Union is doing. Fanny, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And just to quickly pick up on one point you said, if you ever try to convince me of something, don't try it in the morning. Thank you very much for being here so early. Let me start with a very quick introduction to Access Now, to give you a little bit of context, because I'm the only civil society representative on this panel, so I come from a quite different angle on this issue. So Access Now is a global non-profit civil society organization. Our mission is to defend and to extend the digital rights of users at risk around the world. We work in the intersection of human rights and technology. And I have colleagues all around the world, from the US, India, the Philippines, Tunisia, now in Australia as well, so really all around the world. We cover a wide range of issues, from topics like privacy, data protection, freedom of expression, network discrimination, AI, cybersecurity, and more. And we are particularly proud of our digital security helpline, which is 24/7 available in 9 languages. And either if you're exposed to any risk that you experience online, or you just want to learn about these things, you can contact my colleagues. And on that note, if you use Apple products, please disable your FaceTime on all your devices until the security update comes later this week, because there's a really serious vulnerability there they just discovered. All right, so that's the background of the organization, and I'm leading our European efforts here in Brussels. I have the privilege to work with colleagues like Estelle Massé, who I'm sure you guys know if you work in data protection. She is also wearing red today, so you'll find her easily. And I also serve on the board of the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, which matters on this case because my colleagues, my friends, and personally, I have been called a foreign agent, a Soros agent, and a terrorist before. So I have personal experience with how this type of information works on you. And this is spread by the Hungarian government officially, and not necessarily only by dubious websites. So my job here today is actually twofold, because there's no one representing the European Commission on this panel. I will give a very, very brief summary of what the European Union has been doing on disinformation, and then a little bit of reflection from our view on it. And maybe some of the solutions we can keep to the conversation, actually. So I fully agree that we should first define the problem and the terms we're using. And from a policy perspective, I would encourage everyone to stop using the term fake news going forward, and we're trying really hard to do that. And the funny thing about what you mentioned is really why we are talking about this is the US elections and the fact that Hillary Clinton lost. Because the underlying issue, specifically with the business model of some of these companies that are part of the business model that enables the dissemination of this news, it's not new. Even the Cambridge Analytica scandal is not news. The problem had been reported in the past, just the momentum was not there yet to being picked up and stirred a public debate as it did in the end. So first of all, when you talk about European policy, you need to define the problem. At least we would love the European Commission to do that more. And there was a Eurobarometer that tried to measure what people are worried in terms of elections and what manipulation means for them, because we heard a lot of different aspects of manipulation. But in this context, people said that they are worried about manipulated through cyber attacks, through criminal actors trying to influence the elections. And also, 67% said that they worried that their personal data is exposed to some kind of abuse online. And when someone uses the term quote-unquote fake news, they mean very, very different things, which underlines the point why we should not use the term. satire is part of it for some audience responses, poor journalism, propaganda, hyper-partisan opinion ads, politicians' declarations and statements, some form of advertising, and also false fabricated news, including for money or not. So that's the landscape. In the European Union, the manipulation surfaces in relation to elections, but generally speaking in disinformation as well, and tackling disinformation online. The main documents you should look at, and I'm not going to go into details because they're all over the Commission's website, just so you know what you need to look for, is the work started back in October 2017, when the European Commission set up a high-level expert group, originally called Fake News. Luckily, that name was changed to Disinformation later. They published a report in March 2018, and then the Commission took on board the report and added some own policy aspects and issued a communication in April 2018, which then turned into an action plan in 2018. And the 4 pillars all these policies are trying to address. First is the better detection of misinformation, and this work is primarily centered on the European External Action Services work, which is limited to Russia. So at the moment, what they get funding for and they what get mandate to work on is Russian interference. The second objective or pillar is better coordination between member states. The third is how online platforms and social media and the advertising industry could do a better job at tackling this issue. This is the area which translated into the code of practice, which I will talk in details later. And finally, the awareness raising piece for citizens that you also mentioned, how low it is. So, first of all, the code of practice is a set of voluntary measures. I wouldn't even call them self-regulatory, because self-regulation has very important procedural aspects that this code of practice fails to achieve. First of all, it does not include broad enough stakeholders. It doesn't have and it doesn't have a clear, transparent and independent monitoring system. And finally, there's no effective enforcement or sanctioning mechanism linked to it. Why we are really lucky today is because we have a lot of news from yesterday when the European Commission organized their report on the first phase of the monitoring of the implementation of this code of practice, and the participating companies published their first reports. The participating companies are Facebook, Google, Twitter, Mozilla, on the platform side and browser side, and also from the advertisers. It's important to mention that only trade associations are part of it. None of the brands, none of the advertisers took the responsibility to sign themselves the code of practice. What was pretty ironic that while Facebook was promoting what they're doing for transparency in this field, as you mentioned, we just saw the ProPublica reveal that the Who Targets Me API got blocked, and which served, it was a tool to let people, the public, the people know exactly how Facebook users are being targeted by advertisers. So this is the policy landscape. I would still, more the challenges still than the solutions, but at least there's an attempt to tackle this. But what we believe that are missing, and you can read it in our reports, and anywhere else. First of all, we need to continue with the e-privacy regulation. Thank you. So first of all, the European Union should conclude the reform of the e-privacy reform, which addresses the underlying business model issue and the micro-targeting. Second, the transparency of data, both in terms of reporting, but also access for researchers must be improved, and we need to develop actual criteria for this, because the biggest issue with the code of practice is that the measures are, the measures are not measurable. That's the problem. And we must not blindly rely on automated means, but I would be happy to discuss what you see machine learning as a solution. And finally, I would really encourage encourage people to stop looking at kids and young people stupid. Digital literacy should not target young people. They know how not to click on this is the best website ever.com. This is not the vulnerable target audience here. And I would encourage everyone to also look at voting data and to look at other age groups and see where the real impact is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fanny. I would like to open the floor. We started 7 minutes late, so I would like to ask to bear with us for 5-7 minutes more. I know that there is a beautiful coffee break happening, but please, if you really feel the urge to go to drink a coffee, do it in a very quiet manner, so that those that remains here can still listen and participate. Please.
Yes, thank you, Fanny. I'm Patrick Pennings, head of the information. Patrick Pennings, the head of the Information Society Department in the Council of Europe. And I'm very grateful for Fanny to give us an update on what the European Commission is doing. Obviously, the whole report of the high-level group was based on a report made by the Council of Europe, which is called Information Disorder. And that was following a meeting we organized with First Draft, bringing together major media outlets, and that's already a first starting point. That is that we have to do it together, not only institutions but also civil society, Access Now, and also certainly also commercial and other media outlets. I just wanted to say that, well, within that report we defined information disorder in the diversity that Fanny has explained to it: misinformation, malinformation, disinformation. And more importantly, right now we're working on clear recommendations with regards to the manipulative effects of algorithms and artificial intelligence. I just wanted to alert you on that. And these are decisions which will concern not only the European Union countries, but the Council of Europe countries, which means the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, and that includes Russia and Turkey and Azerbaijan and a number of other maybe more suspect countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fanny, do you want to react to that, or is there any other question?
Yeah, so I think I have a general question to all of you. So when people are manipulated, normally the manipulator would use a lot of data, right, in order to personalize the manipulation. And many companies are using public records to do that. So my question, I think, is maybe a bit technical, like how much this is allowed in Europe by GDPR or by any other law. Is it fine to just take a public records of personal data and use it for, let's say, advertising?
Okay, who is the lawyer?
I mean, I'm a lawyer, and the first thing that you learn that you never answer this type of hypotheticals, that it's fine. Like, it's obviously not. Like, but there's also a lot of conflation. Public data and personal data is not the same. And for instance, one aspect of the code of practice, which actually wants to encourage research on this specific issue, because there's plenty of research, and the GDPR has, in our view, a too broad exception actually for research. But in this specific case, as you mentioned, the problem is that the information, even the researchers are dependent on Facebook and other platforms. And there's a commitment at the moment to have a much more broader independent access to this information. I mean, this information.
Bart?
Can I add to this? Maybe this is controversial, but personalized, targeted messages are actually quite desirable in quite a few instances. I want to have personalized ads.
This is arguable. There is a European survey on this, and there's, like, I would not say that we can generally speak for the people to want that.
No, but I'll speak for myself, and I would distinguish between different kinds of decisions. If I'm looking for a specific product, for example, I'd be fine with being receiving specific kind of personalized messages in that respect. When it comes to elections, on the other hand, I think it's really important that people form their opinion on the basis of an impartial representation of different views. So if you only get messages from one specific angle in one specific way, then your capacity to form a kind of judgment on all the different political platforms that there are is being undermined. And that's way more important, this kind of judgment in a democratic sphere, than it is in the sphere of consumption. So if there is something wrong with targeted messaging, I think it's particularly worrisome in the democratic field.
Yeah, just adding, so it can even be in a political realm. You could even then make an argument that it's something positive because those targeted messages are more informative, so people actually understand what's going on. They could also be more relevant, so a nurse could know more about health sector related issues that she wouldn't come across, or he wouldn't come across in the mass media. But then there's one really significant disadvantage of online political marketing, micro-targeting, and that is that you basically create electorates of one. So I get my information that is relevant to me, and if you want to abuse this, you could actually tell me, as a rather young person, that there will be more investment in the education sector, and you would take this away from the pensions, and then you can tell a senior citizen that actually the pensions would go up and we would not know about each other because it's all very intransparent on Facebook. And that has consequences for my level of information, but also for us as a society to have a public debate about what this election is about and what are the arguments and what are the contenders.
I agree. A public deliberation is crucial to any functioning democracy, and that's exactly the point I wanted to make. I mean, that's less important when I make consumption decisions. It's crucial when you talk about democratic elections. So yeah, we need to be able to speak to each other, continue to speak to each other, and do so on the basis of information that's available to all of us.
I would like to share one data, one information with you, because we mentioned a lot these democratic elections, and what I see as the biggest issue with the EU's policies on this information, that it completely ignores the fact that some of the European Union member states are disseminating disinformation and government propaganda. And just so you know, the Hungarian government spent more money, more taxpayers' money on the hatred campaign against refugees and migrants and any NGOs that help them than how much the Leave and the Remain campaign cost together.
A general question, actually, to all speakers. Coming back to what you just said, Bart, about receiving personalized messages or ads that would be okay for you. For me, whether it's commercial or political, it can be okay or ethical, provided I know why I have been chosen for these messages. I think the issue of transparency is very, for me, it's a key issue. And I was surprised that you didn't mention that. None of the speakers, I think, stressed this aspect. For me, it makes a big difference, whether I know or not why I was selected.
I agree. I just got a paper out on nudging, transparency and watchfulness yesterday. So you can look it up online. But obviously, yes, it matters. A kind of influence, a kind of manipulation that you're aware of. The worries are way less if you become aware of that, and it means you are more likely to resist it. It's more likely to bypass it, to bypass this kind of influence or just kind of like see through it. It's crucial. How to make messages more transparent is a difficult question. It's hard to have every single ad, to add to every single ad a message like you're being personally targeted by this company or by this political party, for example. You could do it on a more general level, like say these are the kinds of things that companies and political parties are doing. And it's important to get people informed about these kind of things so that they become more watchful and are better able to detect the kind of influences when they occur.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is any studies that shows the impact of transparency on the impact of manipulation, right? I mean, there is something that is called confirmation bias, where people, even though they know that this message has been manipulated, the message will still have an impact because this is how they think. So I'm not sure that, I mean, transparency is good, but I don't think that's the solution that will solve all the problem about micro targeting.
I meant from the ethical point of view, at least knowing. But it's a long debate. Do you want to say a last word, Fanny, on this, or Judith? No? Okay, I think from what we can hear, it's time for coffee break. We have to thank again all the speakers and thanks also to all of you for your questions. Thanks. Daniel.